folks. Thanks for spending some time with us on our fourth episode of Cybersecurity Decoded here at Rubrik Zero Labs. Quick recap for what we've had so far. Our inaugural guest was Wendi Whitmore from Palo Alto Networks, Unit 42, who has been kind enough to rejoin us for our first recurring guest. So first and fourth guest. How are you doing, Wendi?
I am doing great today, Steve. How are you doing?
Good. For those who may not have run across Wendi before or missed the first episode, just quick background on Wendi. She's the Senior Vice President for Palo Alto Networks, Unit 42, has been there since February 2021. Also involved in a number of high-level initiatives, two that jump out to me, DHS's Cyber Safety Review Board and Duke University's Cybersecurity Industry Advisory Board. And then before her current role, Wendi spent time at IBM X-Force, as well as led teams at CrowdStrike and Mandiant, and then started her career initially as an AFOSI special agent in the Air Force active duty. So, Wendi, I think we just jump right into it, unless there's anything else you want to throw out on your background.
I think, no, you covered it really well. I think the thing that Steve didn't cover is that he and I were fortunate to work together at IBM X-Force. We've obviously also worked at some of the same companies previously, so we're excited to continue that dialogue for sure.
Yeah, it's been really neat to be able to keep a conversation going versus kind of pick it up and put it down. So we're really thankful you're back to chat with us again. So I saw you just briefly at RSA. I saw you had a really busy RSA. If I remember right, you were on a panel for partnerships with advancing cyber diplomacy, which is pretty interesting. And then the one I really liked was the real-world stories of incident response and threat intel. And then the other thing, which really kind of jumped out at me, based on, as you mentioned, working previously and things that I know you really care about, was your own organization, Palo Alto Networks, Unit 42, launching international incident response. So I know your view on that. We've both been part of international teams, worked across regions. I've always really loved what that brings to overall capabilities, but it's tough, right? There's no way around it. It's tough running international teams and making that work day to day. Just knowing how important this has been for you over your career, Wendi, would you mind walking us through why this has been a focus area for you? And how do you manage, international efforts, somebody always being on? What works and what doesn't?
Yeah, Steve, no, I'm glad you brought this up. It's a great question. I think a challenging one though. But the bottom line up front is that cybercrime isn't limited to one geography, and neither are most of the clients that we work with. So in terms of being able to solve their most difficult problems, us having the capability to do that in multiple geographies, speaking across multiple languages and countries, and at different hours and times of the day is really critical. So you mentioned that isn't only coming with positives, right? That can come with some challenges. There are things to manage, and it is challenging to work across different, cultural elements, different time zones, ensure that the handoffs are clean between if you're, conducting a follow the sun model, which we often do between different geographies. That's something that our clients benefit from. Also, though, I think it's just so critical in the sense that so many of these large companies, even if they are a US-based organization, are often going to have different parts of their security teams within different parts of Asia, within different parts of Europe. And so being able to have local resources who communicate in the same language, who can be working the same hours, is really, I think, what's needed. So I'm excited that we were able to do that at Unit 42. We've really been investing for the last 2 years in our international teams. Our EMEA presence is now much larger, so nearly coming up on 35 people plus. And then in JPAC, we are continuing to hire and grow that team. We've got a small team today and are really looking to make that a lot bigger. So I think just making sure that we realize we're not trying to be an American company with, then running essentially an American business in different parts of the world, but you're really honoring the different geographies and realizing we're an international organization that has key leaders and key offices all throughout the globe. And taking that kind of mindset is helpful.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, I've learned in my career, and I think you really hit on the head was, a lot of our respective clients, no matter where they're headquartered, they're global. The intrusions are moving around the clock, and the ability to move with that and potentially get ahead, I think, is really important. So it's really exciting to see, even with all the challenges that come with it. And there are people challenges, there are legacy challenges, there's policy challenges, but excited to see what you guys are working on. because it just usually ends up being worth it. All that hard work and bringing the right talent in is absolutely worth it. So one of the next things we want to kind of jump into, kind of coming off of RSA as well, is it was pretty interesting for us. We just put out our second Rubrik Zero Labs report. And one of my favorite parts of this was we used three different data sets. It was the first time we've gone public with Rubrik telemetry. That was really exciting. We continued the external research, which we did in the first one. And then another part I was really, really excited about was we worked with four different organizations to leverage their core analysis to really help round out blind spots that we have at Rubrik. We've got great data, but we don't see it all. So it was really neat finding not one, not two, but four organizations that were really willing to help us and allow us to use, something that they're really good at. One of which was your own organization, Unit 42. So I think this is something I wouldn't have expected early in my career. The first time we crossed paths, this wasn't the way the world worked. Mandiant did what Mandiant did, CrowdStrike did what it did, 42 did what it did, and those things just didn't come together. And it really feels like that's changing. I'd be curious, Wendy, on your perspective, do you think this is a one-off, or is this something that you're seeing change over your time in this industry, and what are you kind of thinking happens next?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's really exciting, right? You and I have been around for the early days of cyber intelligence analysis. And on the commercial sphere, it often felt like it was a bit adversarial. Like my team wanted to prove that the information we had was so much better than what your team had and that they couldn't coexist. And I don't see that as much today. I think we all are starting to truly mature and realize that each one of us has a different slice of data, and the telemetry sets that we have are unique and they're different. Some are very broad, some are really specific into one certain segment of an industry. And the reality is we need all of those because our clients need all of those, right? We're trying to solve problems across the globe that truly matter. And so the more insights, the more parsing of these different data sets, and the more collaboration that we can offer, I think the better. So, I initially thought that when we started seeing the Russia and Ukraine war, that, we're just infusing a lot of collaboration. And I wondered if it was going to be limited to that conflict. And I think what we've seen is just across the board, so much more industry collaboration, certainly public and private partnership collaboration as well. But what really excites me is what you mentioned, Steve, and that's that industry collaboration.
Yeah, it's been really neat to see. I think one of the things I've loved about our conversations is we can kind of talk about the long view of things and how things are changing. And it would be interesting if I could go back to, early Steve days. I would have been wrong on a ton of stuff. I would never have guessed there was this much collaboration. And I think it allows us to get after some really interesting ground truths. So with that being said, one thing that has changed since the first of these cybersecurity decoded is we've started doing hot takes. So just to have a little fun with it, it's the internet. Nobody holds on to anything in the internet. Everyone's very gracious. So I think I'll kind of lead it off with my first hot take and then ask you for one down the road. But mine is going to be pretty straightforward. I think we can all agree that the Beatles are absolutely overrated as a band. Everybody talks about the Beatles like they're this big seminal band, but when was the last time you got in somebody's car and they put on a Beatles playlist? It just doesn't happen. People don't play Beatles on the jukebox. So I'm just glad that we're all in agreement on that.
I mean, just much like your perspective on different sports teams. I love how you make a statement and then just assume or presume that everyone is in agreement with that, without necessarily getting that feedback. So I think we'll let the audience decide how they feel about
Well,
your hot take.
that's the best part of being a Chicago Cubs fan. Everyone roots for your team too. It's just really a great feeling. I just really recommend it for everybody. All right, so let's kind of dive back to some of the work stuff. I mentioned using your organization's data to round out our view on data security, and in particular, we use a couple different data points around ransomware. One was the demands your organization has seen, which has been as high as 50 million US dollars, and then payouts as high as 7 million US dollars. And then the other thing we talked about that was coming from your organization was the percentage of ransomware engagements. And it was about 36% of all engagements last year that Unit 42 worked. What was interesting is we could take that perspective, we could then combine it with the external research we did, which were 1,600 senior decision makers, half of them CIOs and CISOs. I was surprised. 71% of them said they've paid a ransom at some point in their organization's history. And from the Rubrik telemetry perspective, we could see that almost half of our clients at some point were targeted with precursor or ransomware activity. So this is out there. And I think I've been surprised how many organizations are having to really consider or are actually paying these ransom demands. I'd be really interested on your take, Wendy. What can an organization do to avoid paying a ransom? Nobody wants to do that. How does an organization create levers to be in a good position when it comes to that decision moment?
Yeah, Steve, I think it's such a thoughtful question in the sense that, one, I think my answer today is different than what it would be 12 months ago, maybe even 6 months ago. So during that time frame, my first go-to would have, talked to organizations about ensuring that they had their most critical data backed up. That's absolutely not changed. That's a fundamental solution that's needed. But I think now organizations realize that's part of their cybersecurity foundation. So being able to understand where and what is my most critical data is still the fundamental of that. So I'm going to presume now that organizations have that most sensitive data backed up and they have it offline in areas where it's going to avoid the potential replication of a ransomware attack, that your backups get hammered as well. So why I would say my answer has shifted is because of what we've seen is this trend towards moving towards the extortion piece of ransomware attacks, which largely relies more so on the theft of data and less on the encryption of it. So when we get into that conversation, that's a little different, right? It still circles around that fundamental premise of we need to understand what our most critical data is. But in this lens, you might apply the question of, well, what's my most critical data that if it were released to the public, our company is going to be in hot water, right? And oftentimes that expands beyond just financial data sets, for example, quarterly records, and goes into the communications between executives, sensitive contracts you have with clients, and it can spiral out from there. So what we really want to encourage organizations to do is have that same conversation about ensuring that data is backed up so that you can access it, but also next, have a plan in place for what do we do if this data were stolen and we're exposed? And that relates a lot more to the communications management of an attack. So going back to very similar to traditional breaches, where you might have a nation state attacker, who steals information. That's really what we're seeing from these ransomware actors, but then coupling that with the extortion. And so having a plan in place for what do we do if this data is stolen, being able to contain that data as much as possible. So understanding where it exists, contain locations of it, make sure that it's not widespread and every employee has access right to everything. And so that gets to a lot of what we would consider probably more fundamental best practices that are incredibly important, especially as it relates to ransomware and these extortion techniques.
So, you've hit on something pretty near and dear to my heart. One of the things that obviously as Rubrik has been on its journey, we've had to figure a lot of that out, just what you're saying. I mean, having a backup isn't enough. Being able to understand risk and resiliency is really important, along with still doing those core motions. And what I see as interesting is as we're diving deeper and deeper into that space, we're seeing things like a typical environment is growing its data by about 25% year over year. So the boundaries are moving further and further out. Typical environment has on average 25 million sensitive data records. It's an interesting thing because it feels to me, and I know feel is a dangerous term, but what I'm seeing in data feels a lot like what we saw with endpoint and architecture, in the olden days when this whole incident response business started going. We were at organizations that, built an EDR tool to do response. And then we figured out organizations needed help doing asset management as well as response. And then the EDR did that. And this, on the data side, feels a lot like that. It feels very similar. Like, okay, I've been in this moment before. I've seen this in other realms. So I'd be curious what you would see. We think about data and data security. Do you see some of these other lessons that this part of the community hasn't learned yet? That you're like, hey, we learned this already, or there's a great lesson out there. Do this, don't do that. I'd be really curious what you think we could really leverage or pay attention to as we move forward on that.
Well, I think first I would really highlight and probably foot stomp your comment on data. I think that is the currency of our time, right? And so understanding that from an organizational level and how we protect it really becomes critical, and certainly less about the boundaries and the perimeters, because those are so much more fluid and dynamic these days. So taking all of that aside, we could get into new and exciting technology and how we might leverage that. But I would actually go back to, again, a fundamental best practice, which would be the practice and preparation in advance of these incidents, right? So ensuring that whatever detection capabilities you have, that they're as broad as your organization can afford, essentially. And that's going to depend, right, on the size and maturity of an organization, your industry, the regulatory components you have to deal with. And so using that as a fundamental, then ensuring that your team members, from the CEO to the security staffs and all of their peers, have a real understanding, a clear identification of roles and responsibilities, both during a breach, but also prior to it and then after. And realizing that security is no longer limited. I don't know if it ever was, but there may have been previously a perception that it was limited towards, the security team, and it's the CISO's problem and their staff. And the reality is that peers within legal and ops and finance and certainly at the executive level all need to be equally involved, all need to understand that during an actual incident, each of them are going to be called upon to conduct some really critical tasks. So the more that we as a security field can prepare those team members in advance, ensure that everyone's got playbooks that are tested, that are continuously revisited and not just put on a shelf and left, is going to be critical for the success, regardless of what new attack variation that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I really like all that, especially the part about what comes after, is that reset and then return and then preparing for that. So I think the audience probably is getting pretty bored with me agreeing with virtually everything you say. So maybe we try out your hot take now and see if we can disagree there.
All right, good, because you may not like this one. We'll see. I don't know that we've actually ever talked about this, but sticking to the music theme, I'm going to throw out there that I think Taylor Swift, one of the best songwriters of all time, and her song over the past year, I Bet You Think of Me, might be one of the best written breakup songs of all time. And fun fact, I don't know if everyone knows this, but on that song, she collaborated with fellow RSA panelists this year, the legendary country music artist Chris Stapleton.
I did not know that. I'm a huge Chris Stapleton fan, and this will probably surprise people. I'm a big Taylor Swift fan. I think she puts out really good music.
Had a feeling. I think there are a lot
I
of
would be very nervous dating Taylor Swift, though. She destroys people with the breakup
You
songs.
got to come correct for sure. But you know what? I
Yeah.
bet there are a lot of closet Swifties in our industry that maybe don't talk about it as much.
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know who doesn't like Taylor Swift. I'm sure they're out there too, but I think I'm with you on this one. I think this is pretty good. So let me go back to something else I'm definitely with you on that you mentioned a couple of discussion points ago. You talked about the need for incident response plans and playbooks. I could not agree more. We've worked on those at organizations together. At Rubrik, we talk a lot about orchestrated recovery and how that can really tie into playbooks, and very much a similar thing. One of the things that I don't want to say surprised me, but I think really kind of caught attention, and we've been talking a lot about out of this last report is, we asked these senior leaders, how often do you do this? Do you actually have an incident response playbook? Do you practice this? Do you have orchestrated recovery? And depending on the question, the answer came back about half, like 50 to 54% on any one category. So it's being done, but it's pretty uneven. And I think this is one of those things, I don't know anyone who doesn't think these things are immensely useful, especially after you've used them. Do you have any ideas why, as an industry, these ratios are where they are, and what can we do to really improve these and make this much more fundamental?
Yeah, I think those numbers are staggering, right? To think that this is such a fundamental part of any business these days is being able to, defend against cyber attacks to ensure that they don't disrupt your business. So having up to 50% of organizations that don't have a playbook is really concerning. I also think, though, in some ways it's not surprising in the sense that it's like a dirty little secret, right? I think some organizations are intimidated by how do we start? What do we do? I'm not sure. Maybe other organizations, have brought it up to their leadership teams And it at times I think can be one of those areas where where executives understand it's a priority, but it's like, oh, that's something we're going to deal with later. And, until it becomes a priority that really hits you in the face because you're undergoing an attack. And that's generally when everything changes. So, what I would recommend to organizations would be to say there's a heck of a lot of great material out there that would mean you don't have to start from scratch. You don't even necessarily have to hire an outside firm to get started, right? You can leverage existing material, build that as a foundation, and then continue to look to mature it over time, right? But like any project plan that you would execute in a business, right? Getting the foundation, socializing it with the right leaders, getting people's input and feedback, and then continuing to iterate and mature. And once you get that foundation started, it's then a lot easier to conduct the exercises, which we're talking about, right? Like on a quarterly basis. Even if it's a minimum of just having a conversation at a board meeting or some other sort of executive forum where you've got the right stakeholders involved, you can start really socializing those ideas and building upon them, then finding other leaders on the team that maybe have a passion for this as well, get them involved, right? Just kind of like any idea that we would want executed well in a business. I think there's a lot of ways you can approach it, and again, that don't necessarily relate to just having the technical details, right? That's the easy part. I think the hard part is getting the human involvement, the leadership engaged and really excited about saying, hey, we want to make a true difference in our company so that when and if we are hit, we have a good understanding of how to recover quickly.
Yeah, I think that's really critical because these events are here, and it's either you figure it out in the moment, or you figure it out ahead of time, and then you refine it in the moment, and then do it for the next time. I really liked the priority word you mentioned, and I'd like to kind of pivot to something that I know is a priority for you, and you've written about it publicly several times. I know working with you, it's a passion project, but it's around this idea of how do we as leaders in different tech organizations, how do we improve the representation of underrepresented communities as part of our employees, as part of our staffs? This is something that I think is a lot harder than folks realize once you start getting into it. I've heard a lot of organizations talk about how important it is, but I've seen not near as many organizations discuss meaningful ways they're pushing this forward. So I would love to kind of get your take on what are the right meaningful ways to address this real talent problem. And this, I hate that it's discussed as an inclusion problem, because I don't think it's inclusion. I think it's getting all the available resources to bear, and we've got blind spots and bad habits as an industry. So I'd be really interested in what do you see as the ways that we really get after this?
Yeah, for me, I think it starts with educating and awareness that this industry, for one, exists, and that it's as cool and exciting as it is in terms of the problems that we're solving at as an age as possible, right? It just simply, like, we don't have enough teachers today who have an understanding or background in cybersecurity, who know a lot about it. And so if you look at like an elementary school level, junior high, high school, that's really where we need to be starting to increase, like, so we can create this huge pipeline of the best students that exist, right? That would then allow us to bring in, I think, a lot more diversity of thought, a lot of really smart people who are coming from a wider variety of backgrounds. So for me, I'm starting to really get involved at the university level. You mentioned my involvement with Duke. I'm also involved with my alma mater, which is University of San Diego, and they've got now a master's in cybersecurity engineering. So we're starting to see a lot of really cool programs come out related to these degrees. But I think the more that we can reach those younger generations, let people or ensure people, I should say, from wide variety of communities, different cultures, geographies, genders, whatever it may be, but ensure that the best and brightest are aware that this field, as engaging and exciting as it is really going to make a difference. I think when we talk about this a lot, we focus on like, how do we hire for our teams? And I could talk you through a lot of the great initiatives we're doing at Palo Alto just to ensure that we, from a mathematical perspective and looking at how we solve the problem, that we're doing it in a way that really ensures we're increasing diversity. That's really exciting. But I honestly think that the real change has to occur so much earlier on. So the more that each of us can be mentoring young students, be speaking to universities, high schools, just getting out there in the community, talking about what it is we're doing. I've yet to find somewhere where I went to speak and talked about what I did, and people left and said, like, oh, well, that's boring. Like, I wouldn't want to do that, right? It's always, wow, this is super cool. This is really interesting. You guys are solving really interesting problems. And I think the more we can educate about it, the better.
You talk about the representation aspect, and I think one of the things that I personally found really needed, kind of going back to the RSA discussion, is the panel you were on with incident response. Those were powerhouse names of individuals and organizations, and it happened to be women. And I think that I heard a lot of discussion about it. I heard a lot of people talking about, oh, I didn't know this was this kind of panel, or I didn't know this. And I was like, this is high-end incident response leaders and experts talking about it. And I thought that was really neat to see that it was represented, and it stuck in my mind something else that you wrote in a different article talking about being young at the very beginning of your career and seeing a woman federal agent and thinking, who is she, what does she do? And that's really been in my mind and has stuck with that. And so I think to kind of segue into the last question, I'd be really interested if you had to go back to that version of Wendi, to that second lieutenant Wendi Whitmore, as you're just starting your path and all the things you learn now. What would you tell the younger version of yourself? What would you give yourself that you wish you had then?
I think so. It's a great question, Steve. I think I got a lot of great guidance at the time, right? So I was coming from military unit and going into one that was there were certainly fewer women, and actually this is a great opportunity to highlight. We were engaging online about someone who I know is a close friend of so many of ours and so well respected in the industry, and that's my dear friend Joyce Lynn. And Joyce passed away 3 years ago, just around last week, in a plane crash. And we lost as an industry one, I think, of the most spectacular human beings, but certainly spectacular technologists and industry leaders we've had. And I say that because Joyce and I entered a field together as second lieutenants coming straight out of college, where we were the only two females in the group at the time. And so, she and I bonded. I was really intimidated by her in terms of just her absolute brilliance. But we bonded and we maintained a friendship, a close friendship for over the last 20 years. And I think the thing that, she and I both did is we never approached it as like, oh, we're different and we have some hurdle to overcome because of that. Really focused on doing as good a job as possible in every job that I've ever had. And that's what I would want to encourage the younger generation, is that every day you go to work is an opportunity to do something great, and to make a difference. And, Joyce was presented with this opportunity when she was a first lieutenant, so just about 3 years into our career in the Air Force, where she went to DCFL, so the Defense Computer Forensics Lab, and was asked to start up this task force and kind of see where it goes, because there was this threat to national security related to cyber attacks. And she did that as a first lieutenant. That became the NCIJTF. And when she left, a colonel took her position 3 years later. So, anyone in the military knows that's a huge, huge discrepancy, and really shows that she demonstrated by just absolutely crushing that job how big of a problem we had, and that we needed senior leadership to be focused on this, to allocate resources. And I think that's a great example of, like, she certainly didn't enter that role thinking that, I'm going to go in and then, come out as a colonel on the back end, right? She said, I just want to go in and solve what I believe is this truly important problem for us to tackle every day. And that's what I would encourage anyone, regardless if you're just starting out or if you're, entering a job that you've been in for a while and maybe not feeling as passionate about it today.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Joyce has affected a lot of our individual lives, and this entire industry we work in is shaped by her hands. There's massive fingerprints everywhere. The whole way that I just think the sheer preponderance of organizations that are doing IR and threat intel together, like organizations that we worked in. I mean, even just there's 100 examples, but something that we all take as gospel truth. This makes sense. We should do it this way. she had to blaze a lot of trails for that. So
Yeah.
I think I couldn't think of a better example for all of that. Wendy, we really appreciate the time again today. Would love to have you back anytime. I could not enjoy these discussions more. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and thanks again for jumping on with us.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the invitation, and love the conversation as well. So look forward to talking to you anytime.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We appreciate your time, and this is our 4th episode of Cybersecurity Decoded.